Oh. I'm going to ask, can I be heard?
I hear you.
Paul, can you hear me? I'm Vern.
Hi, Vern. I hear
I
you.
can't hear anyone though.
Well, that sounds like an issue on your end. Although everybody else is muted, so you're not going to hear them except because I'm the one talking at the moment. So, well, welcome everybody. Oh, not quite. Apple says it's not quite 7 yet, so I'll give it a second, and then we'll. The congregation I serve in Michigan, we have a number of Afghan refugee families come into the community, and we volunteered to co-sponsor one of the families. And we were very excited. They've been here for a couple months living in a hotel. We were very excited on Saturday because they finally received housing. So they had an apartment, and we had a storage unit with like all kinds of furniture to fill a 2-bedroom apartment, mostly with stuff. And so we're all excited to get them moved in. And it was wonderful. We got to the apartment complex on Saturday, and the walk into the apartment was less than pleasant. These are folks without credit, so they're pretty low-end apartments, and the community that they're living in isn't the most pleasant, and there's odors of marijuana smoke wafting through the hallway as you're walking in. But the apartment itself was nice. It was all newly painted, new flooring, new carpet, new cabinetry in the kitchen. Looked great. Got everything moved in. Sunday went over to pick up the family to help them move in officially into the apartment because they hadn't been able to get on Saturday. So Sunday afternoon we're there. And because they speak Farsi, which none of my congregation do, I get there and they inform me that they have decided they're not going to move into the apartment because they didn't feel comfortable in the community and it didn't feel safe for them, which everybody on the team who helped move them in kind of empathized with. But now we have to think about what are we doing? What's our purpose? What's our plan? Why are we helping to sponsor this family? And what are our goals? And how do we frame this? Because everybody was hoping to get them into an apartment and then they can move on, with the rest of their lives. And the first thing we decided was that the 2-bedroom furnished apartment, which was actually largely donated by one family, used furniture that they had. We were just going to give to another family willing to take that apartment. In part because we didn't want to have to move it twice. It was painful enough to move it the first time, didn't want to do it the second time. And we decided our purpose and our goal was to get Afghan families settled, refugee families settled. And if it meant a different family got the furniture, that was okay. And there's a bunch of fresh food in the fridge. So we told the social worker, please give that to somebody who will consume it. We don't care who eats it, just somebody in need. And now we kind of have to step back and realize that our whole goal was to help this family get settled in a way that makes sense for them and restart our process. But remembering our goal and remembering what we're about and what we're trying to do for this family helps make setbacks like that a little more manageable. Because on the one hand, it's kind of frustrating when you're this close to our big goal. But on the other hand, they should have autonomy and they should be able to have a say in the place where they're going to live and make sure they feel safe. So that's that's a place where knowing your mission, knowing what you're about, knowing your purpose is important, and it can help you when you come across setbacks, you come across things that don't make sense. Now today that's kind of what last month was about. Today we're going to talk about governance and management and congregation councils and where they get into weeds and where they kind of miss the mark. But my first question for you is, and let's kind of invite you to jump in and share what are some of the qualifications when you look for somebody to serve on your congregation council? What are some of the qualifications you want in somebody? What do you got? Anybody got one? What do you look for? Susan, you unmuted. So did you have an idea?
Well, I think somebody that's friendly and open so that people feel that they can talk to them. I would have to say probably dedicated.
Okay.
That they can count on you.
Okay. What are some of the other qualifications you look for somebody serving on congregation council?
In our case, people who are in council are the chair of their respective committees. So for example, I serve on council and I'm chair of the stewardship board.
So my question would be, which direction does that flow? Do you get conscripted to be the chair of a board, and then that automatically that compels you to be part of council, or do you serve?
That's the way it works right now.
So then the question for you is actually one level away. Then the question would be, how do you choose people to lead committees and teams?
Well, sometimes that's a real problem because I look for a relationship. I look for a skill set. For example, a teacher who is someone whose teacher could be the chair of the education team, as a for instance.
Okay, sure. Okay, I look for people who are positive and hopeful. The person that's always complaining, there's a tendency sometimes to say we should put the person who's always complaining on council, so then they have a place to vent their complaints and they can fix all the problems. The problem is those people usually just keep complaining. And ultimately what they do is they drag every conversation down into a pit of hopelessness and despair. And then they tend to not want to take on any challenges or do anything different because they're always negative. I want people who are active in the life of the congregation. So we need to be able to see you in worship on a consistent basis. You need to be part of it. If you show up once every 3 months, that's not worth it. Vern, what do you got?
Yeah, I was just going to say, your discussion there is really interesting. Is it governance or is it administrative? And if you get somebody in there, you want them to be compatible with the pastor and the staff and everyone, and you want them to have an interest in what we're doing. But then how do you solve problems, or how do you identify problems if you don't have someone who is willing to identify a problem? But then we need to quickly turn that around and look for the positive. If somebody perceives that as an issue, how do we solve that? Is that governance or is that administrative?
Well, we'll get there. I would say that people who are positive and hopeful aren't necessarily people who don't ever say anything negative. My problem is that there's this movement that says, well, we should take the complainer and put them on council so they have a place to complain. And that ends up just sucking the life out of the room, in my experience. Rebecca, you have a virtual hand raised. Rebecca Sievers?
I think having people on there, they need to, yeah. Can you hear me?
I hear you.
Okay, I think it's important for whoever you're looking at to be a respected member of the congregation. Like you said, they need to show up on Sunday, but I've been on committees at universities and different things where you try to bring in, like you say, the kind of the naysayer of the group of, and it's worked both. I've seen it work and I've seen it fail. Sometimes it works where they really come to realize what it being on council or what being on a committee of some import is all about, and they kind of join the fold. And then it's gone the other way, as you said too. So it's a risk whenever you do that.
Yeah, I'm cautious of that, and I don't want to have every council meeting degenerate into something. So
Right.
I want people committed to the mission and ministry of the congregation. Vern, what do you got?
Just going to ask the question, what do you do if you're having trouble filling the post?
Well, then you need to figure out. So the first question is to ask specifically to the people on council, why are you on council? And what do you get out of being on council?
Yeah.
I think also we tend not to write job descriptions that are very clear. And so we aren't very clear with people what we expect them to do. And if we're not very clear with people on what we expect them to do, then we just kind of vaguely ask them to be on a committee. It just sounds like one more thing that I really don't want to do, and one more night I don't want to be out. I think that, and I think that if you can frame it in a way that makes it positive and hopeful, and talk about what you are as a group, then, you know, like any of the other volunteer kind of things we can talk about. So, Devin.
Thanks.
Yeah, I think you're talking around a lot of the. I agree with most things that have been said, but for me, it comes down to somebody who is excited about the ministry of the congregation. Obviously, they need to participate. I'd like to see them financially committed to supporting the organization. I'd like to see them as generally positive and hopeful as you suggest. But somebody who's specifically excited about the ministry of the congregation. If they're not excited about the ministry, then they're not going to help lead forward very much.
Right.
And if you can't, I mean, that when I'm looking for council people, I'm looking for people who are most excited to be there on Sunday morning and Saturday afternoons and Wednesday nights and whatever our activities are. Those are the folks that I want to see be part of leadership.
Absolutely. Well, we have an example from Scripture. In Acts, they have to, in the first chapter of Acts, we find out that they have to replace a disciple. Judas is gone, so they need a new one. So one of the men who accompanied us during all the time that the Lord Jesus went in and out among us, beginning from the baptism of John until the day when he was taken up from us, one of these must become a witness with us to his resurrection. So they proposed to Joseph, called Barsabbas, who is also known as Justus, and Matthias. And they prayed and said, Lord, you know everyone's heart. Show us which one of these two you have chosen to take place in this ministry and apostleship, from which Judas turned aside to go to his own place. And they cast lots for them, and the lot fell upon Matthias, and he was added to the 11 apostles. So here they have their criteria, right? Somebody who's been with us through it all, accompanied us from the beginning, and then they cast lots. And I actually have a friend who he had a problem in his congregation where it seemed like people got elected to council because certain cohorts or cliques in the congregation got together and formed voting blocks and would elect their person to council. And he got them to put into their constitution that they would have 2 or 3, if they had 3 slots to fill, they'd have 4 or 5 candidates, and they would literally draw names out of a hat to choose the next person on council. And it was really effective. It did a couple of things. One thing it did is it destroyed the opportunity to have a voting block, because you couldn't have a voting block. It also meant that if you didn't win it, if you didn't get elected to council, there was no shame, because it just meant that the 6-year-old kid pulling names out of the hat didn't pull your name out. So there wasn't like shame that you weren't appreciated. I thought it was really shrewd of him. But we can see that, you know, there's expectations and criteria. So we don't just pick, you know, people with a pulse or the warm body. So council members have criteria, have responsibilities, and we can call these, one of the ways of sorting that out is to talk about these duties. So one is the duty of care, which is, and under this, we talk about actively participating in meetings and in conversations, to fill their role, to read documents ahead of time, do all the things like that they're supposed to do, you know, and understand their rules, their role in the context of the constitutional expectations. We can talk about a duty of loyalty. So this is the idea that you act in the best interest of the congregation as a whole, and that you're not there to represent your own little clique clique, your own little subset or your small group. You're just there to advocate for the choir or just there to advocate for the Sunday school or whatever it is. But you're speaking to the whole, and you're speaking for and looking at the entirety of the congregation. It also means in some cases that you need to be clear about any conflicts of interest. So you have to be clear about, financial contracts or things like that, so that there's some transparency around that. And finally, duty of obedience. So you agree to be faithful with a congregation's mission, which is why you need to know what your mission is, and you're not going to act in conflict with that, and you're gonna agree to leave meetings generally supporting whatever it is that the congregation council voted to do. Even if you voted against it, you're still going to be publicly obedient to that and publicly part of that team. Okay. So we have a duty of care, which is participating, being an active member, being conversant in it. Duty of loyalty, which is acting in the best interest of the congregation, not just the best interest of yourself or your own personal opinions or whatever small group you have. And obedient, so you're faithful and obedient to the congregation's mission and where they're going. Okay. So now we want to talk about the congregation's, the role of the council as a whole. And I think I can make this work. I have a quiz for you. So give you a second to take the quiz. Just the question is, our church council spends most of its time on matters vital to the future of the church. So strongly agree, slightly agree, neutral, slightly disagree, strongly disagree. All right. Oh, did we get everybody? Has everybody answered? Anybody else need to? Okay. So it looks like we have everybody is either neutral or better, and most people feel that their councils spend most of their time on matters vital to the future of the church, which is a beautiful thing. Any thoughts on that question? Oh, did I share results? Did I share results with you? Yeah, I did. I'm sorry. Okay. All right. So now I have two questions for you guys in breakout rooms that I'm going to give you to discuss. And the two questions are, when have you been the most frustrated during a council meeting? And when have you been the most fulfilled or hopeful during a council meeting? And did it all?
is looking at legacy gifts and developing some policies around gifts or endowments that hadn't existed before, just kind of putting some structure in place that wasn't there. So I think that's good work for a council to do. You, like you said, one of the most frustrating is really being involved in budgeting issues when things aren't going well. When things are smooth, it's pretty easy. And we have a very mission-oriented church and a lot of faithful givers. So I'm thankful for that. And we have a really good council.
I think for us, and I serve in the same church as Pastor Devin. And I believe one of the best things we've been doing lately is we have a lot of landscaping upgrades and just beautification projects that need to go on. And we get a lot of members of the church, not just of the council, that are willing to step up and help out. And it says a lot about a congregation when people are willing to just give a Saturday and come out and do something, and because they feel called to do it. And it's really nice to see people doing things of that nature. And
So did any themes come up? Was there any commonality between what was your most fulfilling or most frustrating? Owen?
It seemed that one of the most frustrating things for among us was that when there were intense disputes, sometimes they left. Well, some people maybe resigned a council position or caused a deep division.
Okay. Okay. Yeah, intense disputes are definitely going to be painful. What any other themes that came up? When were you fulfilled as council members? Or when did you sense that in the council?
Sorry.
Uh,
Rebecca?
Well, I was, I think we tended to talk a little bit more about what were more of the things to watch out for, like, and it's tough with budgets that it's a tough budget season, and that I had mentioned not letting a person kind of run the room, or having one large personality is kind of just something to watch out for.
Yep. A large personality that gives space for other people to speak and participate and helps them do that is one thing. A large personality that wants to be the only personality in the room is a different beast. Definitely. Okay. All right. Well, let's talk about governance and mission a little bit, and talk about what that looks like. So I have this is stolen from borrowed, adapted from Hotchkiss, D, governance and ministry. And he has this diagram here. So on the one hand, we have this difference between governance and management. Governance is oversight, as we're going to define it. Management is going to be everything else. So governance is the responsibility of the congregation council. Governance is the big picture. It is the duty of obedience, understanding the mission of the congregation, setting the mission, setting strategies to accomplish your mission, but it's also then delegating responsibility for fulfilling the objectives, which is when we get to management. So management is everything else, and ideally led by the senior pastor. So we add management to this column. So we have governance over here, and we have management over here. Governance is the church council or congregation council. These are these core leaders, and they set the marching orders for everything, right? Management is going to be headed by pastoral leader and staff. Now, in a church, inevitably things immediately get messy, because if you look at this, you got to assume the pastoral leader over here in the management column also lives to a certain degree over here in the church council column, which creates a challenge. And you have to kind of be clear as the pastoral leader, and the council as lay leadership has to help that person be clear about whether they're in the governance role or they're in the management role, depending on what's going on. Right. So the council sets policies that the management then enacts, and by setting policies, it frees the management to make decisions. So every time somebody wants, say every time an outside group wants to use your church building, if the staff and the pastor have to go back to the council to get permission for that to happen, nothing's ever going to happen. But if the council has a policy that says this is our policy about who can use the building and when, then that frees management to do their job. And it makes them feel less like they're being micromanaged in the process. Now there's accountability, right? Because the staff and the pastoral leader are accountable to the congregation council, but so under that, we have the council then has advisory committees, depending on what your structure looks like. You'll have a finance committee, maybe a nominating committee, sometimes a personnel committee, a governance committee that looks at like constitutional issues and things like that. You have these committees that kind of feed information up to the church council. On the management side, you'll have your committees or your teams, right? Contemporary worship, traditional worship, VBS, Sunday school, depending on your congregation, the different ministries that take place. So you have the teams functioning under here. These are the kind of people that put the day, again, see the distinction is this is putting day-to-day stuff together, right? Implementing the worship services and things as opposed to advisory committees. You know, the finance is much more a big picture, longer term kind of thing. In the center, of course, you have to have collaboration and planning so that if the contemporary worship needs financial resources to make things happen, the finance team is aware of that and has some way of bringing those things to be. So that'll function in the middle. And under that, of course, is the congregation that's experiencing all of these things happening to them. So one metaphor for this, when we talk about the distinction between governance over here and management over here, is the image of a railroad. So for example, you might have a railroad with a corporate board. The board does the governance, right? The board decides where you're going to put the rails. It decides what cities you're going to connect, like the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe. They're going to decide what kind of cars to buy. They're going to budget for maintenance, meals, and that kind of stuff, right? This is the corporate board that they're going to set that tone. Whereas the conductor is the one that's got to manage, deal with the stuff on the ground, what's happening right there. They're in charge of what happens on the train, on the rails themselves. So they're going to oversee the staff, the porters, the cooks, the coal hauler. They're going to set the schedule. They're going to determine meals, determine what maintenance is needed within the context of the budget. Right. So we have this kind of distinction. The challenge that happens is inevitably when governance starts taking over management, or management starts taking over governance. And when those things aren't clear, that's when challenges happen, right? So, for example, if governance takes over management, that feels like micromanaging. So if everything the pastor does they're expected to go back to council to get permission, that's micromanagement, and very few people like to live in that world. That gets exhausting. So in my first call, my congregation council caught me off. It caught me at a weak moment. I must have been tired. And we had our council meetings. We had a 9:30 worship service, an hour of Sunday school, and then so 9:30 to 10:30 is worship, 10:30 to 11:30 is Sunday school, and then at 11:30 on Sunday morning we would have congregation council meetings, which is a brutal time for that. And one time they decided, this is back when long distance still existed, which I guess dates me. They decided that they were anxious about the long distance bill because it was way more than it should have been. And they decided that the way to manage the long distance bill was every time I made a phone call, a long distance phone call, a church phone call, I had to write down the number I called. And then I was to check a box whether it was for personal or business use. And they caught me at a weak moment, and I said, okay, I'll do it. And I think for about a year, I filled out that stupid form. And in a year, I didn't make a single personal long distance call. I know you're probably shocked by that, but it was exhausting. And eventually I just said, I'm not going to do it anymore. I don't make personal calls on the church phone. I don't make inappropriate long distance calls on the church phone. If that's the policy, I'll abide by the policy, but I'm not going to be micromanaged on everything, because it just sucks the life out of you. Every time you'd have to write it down, it was just, on the other hand, if management takes over governance, if management makes all the decisions, then it's just a rubber stamp. And the council doesn't really have a role at that point. They're just kind of going along with what everybody says. And if you don't have policies in place, then everything has to get back to the council for a decision constantly. And then this council is responsible for everything. So if there's no accountability, the council has no purpose. With no advisories committee, the council ends up with too much work. And if the pastoral leader has no teams, they get exhausted. Remember, this is our this is our image, right? So if there are no staff or teams to support the pastoral leader, then the pastoral leader ends up doing everything all the time, and that's exhausting. On the other hand, if the advisory committees don't do any work and feed any information up to the congregation council, then they do end up doing everything, and that gets exhausting. So it's a matter of figuring out which you're doing and how you keep things balanced in that context. Good questions about that metaphor, that idea.
Just a quick question, and maybe you're going to get there, but are you going to say more about the congregation's role in this model? I mean, it's a great model if you can fill out the teams and everybody's doing their jobs. But it seems to me for this system to work, there also has to be a healthy congregation, and the congregation has to feed these teams and take their responsibility. Otherwise, the pastor and the staff and the council end up doing too much, and they're doing, as I think you inadvertently said, all these things are happening to the congregation, which is ideally, of course, not what you want.
Right. Well, obviously, if you don't have a healthy congregation to feed into these other places, you don't have people willing to take responsibility for these various, for the committees or the teams that implement the policies and put things into place, then that's not going to work. And then the congregation as a whole has to feed people into these spaces. One of the challenges in a smaller congregation is that there's a lot more overlapping. The smaller congregation, the more overlapping you have, and the more overlapping you have, the more messy things get. And like I said, especially for the pastor, they have to kind of really be clear in their head where they're functioning. Am I functioning in my management capacity over in this column at this point? Am I dealing as I interact with staff and parishioners and these various teams, or am I over here at this moment functioning in this governance capacity, helping to put together policies, helping to contribute to conversation and dialogue, helping to take the information from the advisory committees and the rest of it. And the smaller the congregation, the more challenging this is, because the more overlapping and the more intermeshing things happen. And that is one of the difficulties of a small congregation, and the sense that the same people are doing everything, and then things do get messy. And there are people who are good there are people who might be very good over in implementing stuff, who can't think up ideas themselves, or who might be really good workers but are not really good leaders. And when you get a bad leader in a bad position that doesn't seem coachable, then that causes trouble too. And you have to kind of figure out how to manage that and make sure that you get the right people in the right places. Ideally, governance, the congregation council puts policies together that allows the pastoral leader and the staff the freedom to do their jobs and to implement things without feeling like everything they do has to be approved by the congregation council. Do I have? Yeah. And it is a matter of finding balance in the midst of things. And I think sometimes where where functioning gets poor and where people's sense of fulfillment goes down is when the council is forced to function in management as managers of everything, and where they aren't allowed to do that oversight. And what that does is it means that when you do that, then you have no time or energy to talk about the future. You have no time or energy to vision for what your mission is going to be. You have no time or energy to kind of think about the hard, thorny questions that don't have quick, easy answers, and allow time for things to process, because you're too busy negotiating with one another and trying to figure out who can get the best deal on toilet paper because you need a case of it for next week, or where those things can happen. And part of this is to keep the council out of the weeds, keep the council out of all the minute details, the day-to-day details, so that they can focus on the bigger picture, so that they can oversee things rather than be the ones that do everything. Again, and then, you know, if you're, of course, as Paul Stratton talked about, the council being comprised of all the chairs of the teams or the committees, that has its own challenge, right? Because if the committee chair is in a management role, but then they're also asked to be in a governance role, then they have that same challenge that the pastor has, is trying to figure out what they're doing, in which capacity, at which time. All right. So I wanted to have you guys talk about thinking back. I wanted to invite you to think about times when you were fulfilled as a member of council and as a leader in the church, or when you're extremely frustrated, and what was the difference in how the group was functioning? What was the difference in where the group was focusing? What do you think made that difference for you? And let's see. We're gonna shuffle. And so I want you to think about times when you've been fulfilled and times when you've been frustrated. And what was the difference in how the group was functioning and focusing? Where was the attention of the council in those times? And I'll put those in a yeah. Oh, they don't give me enough. I think I have to do, let me see. Sorry. All right. So, oh, there you go.
Pressed the wrong button. I meant to stay in there, but I left it. Oh no.
Oh, whoops. You probably had the most brilliant comment to add just at the end too, didn't you?
No. It was the conversation was picking up.
Oh, whoops. And I pulled you out. That's my bad.
Yeah. No, I fat fingered it.
It's hard to know. Oh well. Where are you, Owen?
I'm at Spirit of Peace in Richmond
In-
Hill, Georgia.
in
Yeah, with Pastor
Georgia?
Devin.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Cool.
Yeah.
This
But,
cohort comes from all over, mostly the Eastern time zone, but all over the place.
Mhm.
So I don't necessarily know where. And the idea of doing how, the check-in with everybody, sometimes that just sucks most of the day away. So
Mm.
I don't always find where people are from. So, well, welcome. I'm up in the frozen tundra of Michigan with
I'm
Debbie
sorry.
LaFontaine and Paul Stratton. So, yeah. Well, did you guys find in times of difficulty where your focus was? Was there kind of or in times of fulfillment where your focus was? What were you guys paying attention to when things weren't going as well? What was the group's central kind of place to look at? Did you find any commonalities in times of frustration or times of joy?
It seemed in our group that commonality was when the council is divided and acrimonious, that's very unpleasant for just about everybody.
Mhm.
And when it's united and all pulling together, that's a high point for just about everyone.
Okay. And when you're acrimonious, what kinds of things are you focusing on?
Winning the argument.
Which is focusing in really on the individual, right? It's me getting my way. And when you're all pulling together, I'm guessing that's kind of a sign of focusing on the mission and ministry of the congregation, right? Anybody else see any of those patterns?
Yeah. First of all, I'd like to apologize to my group for leaving that discussion by accident. But I think the two examples that I heard of the negative were exactly what you said, where the council becomes so myopic and narrow focused on itself and the things that they were arguing about that it created kind of the toxic environment. But then Pastor Webb shared a story. I think she used the phrase where people were interested in the gospel and spreading the gospel, and she shared a story about an ecumenical group that has, I think she said, 6 congregations and some other agencies in the community that created a paper pantry, and it's still in existence. And so she said like that provided a lot of hope and fulfillment for the congregation, and it was focused. They were focused on on things that were outside,
Mhm.
in kind of service to the community and themselves. So I thought that was a nice story. So.
Yeah, absolutely. So if you can focus on ministry and things like that, and working together to accomplish something rather than making sure that each individual returns back to their home base, advocating in the right way. Part of this model and looking at the distinction between governance and management is trying to keep people in their own lane. So the council has this oversight lane, and if the council starts doing all of the management stuff, they don't have time or energy for all the other things. And the other thing is the smaller details you get into, the more down in the weeds you get, the more likely you are to find things that you disagree about. Like we can agree kids should eat, right? Regardless of income level, every kid should eat. Fair enough? Thumbs up? We can go with that right now. If that's our principle, then we can, but then we start saying, well, how should we make sure that every kid eats? And then we can, and if we go far enough down, we'll find somewhere in our group where we find things we disagree about, and how we might implement that vision. We might find things that we disagree about, or even harshly, but if we can keep our conversations at that overarching goal and then empower other people to implement it, it can free us to find our commonality, our common space, hopefully centered around something gospel and Jesus centered and positive. The congregation council needs to give parameters for people to function, right? So they can give barriers and lanes for the pastor and the staff to do their jobs, but they also have to give them freedom to make those jobs happen. And the freedom to do the job in a way that makes sense for that individual, depending on what their gifts are and the way that they function, or that group or that team or that kind of thing. Again, the more, Devin, what's up?
Oh, I just wanted to affirm your point. One of the folks in our group said we got talking about how we as congregations managed during the pandemic, and one of our very wise folks said that we always have a duty to care for those in the group, and you use that as one of your principles of counsel. And I just think it's really helpful to remember that as we're dealing with issues, we always have that responsibility of still caring for the whole group, which helps pull me away from my own personal opinions about any given issue. That as a council member, I have some responsibilities to care.
Right, and then if we can find a starting point of saying it's our responsibility to care for everybody, it's our responsibility to create space for people to be able to gather. Then the next question is, how can we create that space and do that safely and responsibly, and answer some of those questions. And hopefully that avoids some of the hostility, particularly that has grown up around this time. I will say these days are harder than ever. It's still challenging. People are still stressed out and exhausted. And stress is cumulative, and you can't like have stress in your bucket and say, well, this is my stress from COVID, I'm going to put it over here, and it's not going to impact me when I come to work, or it's not going to impact me when I get to the church council, or it's not going to impact me when I go home and I interact with my spouse or my children. And my children, of course, they're able to differentiate all their stress, right? Well, teenagers are infinitely good at that, right? They clearly, and it all becomes cumulative. I tell you a story about my wife as a lactation consultant who keeps running into fathers who are like having fainting spells. People who would have been perfectly healthy and fine. She works with nursing moms, and she's had multiple stories of these new fathers who are like passing out and stuff. It's stress, and it's not because they're not able to handle stress. It's just because there's so much everywhere. And then you throw a new baby on top of it, their bodies just can't manage it. And without COVID, they would never have the problem, I'm convinced. So all these things make all of our jobs harder. So the more we can push people to think at high levels, to think about the overarching understandings and the things that we can agree on, and then how we create policies that allow staff and teams and things like that to function, and give them autonomy. Because if you don't give them autonomy, they're never going to do anything. They're never going to do their jobs. They're just going to quit because you've told them, you've communicated to them they're not really empowered to do that. It's because if you overfunction and do everybody's job for them, eventually they'll just quit and let you do their job too. People tend to be happy with that. Or you run into people who tell you they claim they want your help, but they set it up in such a way that it's impossible to actually give it. And I usually assume those people don't actually want my help, which is fine. Then I don't have to do that. Somebody else can do it. Okay. I will. So we're going to talk about money next month. This month, though, you do have homework. Let's see, real quick. So we have our governance and our management ideas. Homework to discuss as a council. Look at your past couple of months of minutes if you get a chance during one of your council meetings. Spend 20 minutes talking about this. Where do you spend your time as you look at your minutes? Do you spend it in governance or management? And which do you spend it in more? And and how can you bring it back into balance if you discover that 3/4 of your meeting is about management? What are you going to do to address that issue? And where do you see the distinction? If you have questions, I'm available. My email address and my cell number and my.
Paul, can you send out the your PowerPoint?
I will send my PowerPoint out to the attendees. I
Thank
will
you.
put my contact in the chat, and yeah, I will do both. And you do get email reminders. And next month we get to talk about money and finances and the relationship to all that, which is always fun, right? Nothing brings more joy than talking about money. So, all right. Thank you all for giving time this evening. I like to honor your time by beginning on time and ending on time. So unless you guys have anything for me, I will bid you adieu and have a pleasant evening, and I'll see you next month.
Thanks, Paul.
Thank you.